Yo, здравствуйте, god dag, god night. Today I want to share the method that I use to teach myself languages. I currently speak 3 languages fluently: English, Norwegian, and Russian. And through the years I've taught myself several more, and I thought perhaps it might be interesting for people to know how I do it. I will first speak a little bit about my own personal history with learning languages. People can skip this part if they like and just go right into my method. English is my native language. I spoke pretty much only English until I was about 18 years old. And then one day I randomly decided to start teaching myself Swedish. I was going off to university at the time, and after 1 year of university I was able to go on an exchange program to Sweden. And I'd pretty much reached a level of fluency on my own before I went there. I was able to then go and take courses that were taught in Swedish at the time. And on the way traveling to and from Sweden, I was able to stop over in Iceland for several days each way. And I thought, this is hands down the most beautiful place I've ever been at. Very cool place to be. And I thought, how cool would it not be to plan in 2 more years to go and take a master's program in Iceland? So I went back to Canada, finished my degree there, and began teaching myself Icelandic while in Canada. And I managed again to get myself to a pretty much level of fluency before I then went back to Reykjavik. And I went to university there, and then was able, of course, to take courses that were taught in Icelandic while I was there. It was great fun, had a good time. After graduating there, I was quite certain that I wanted to remain somewhere in Scandinavia and move there permanently. And for my work at the time, I decided to try to move to Norway, which meant that approximately at the time that I was finished at university, I began to teach myself Norwegian. And I managed to succeed quite well with that. I moved to Norway. I have now lived here for almost 8 years. And Norwegian is now the language which I use most every day. And since moving here, once you start teaching yourself languages and kind of get to enjoy that process, you start to kind of get addicted to it. And after a couple of years of living in Norway, I was missing a little bit that part. I was looking for something new to do. And so I decided to start teaching myself Russian, primarily to kind of be more interested in my family history. And I've kept that up really well. I pretty much use Russian every single day in some form. And I've also dabbled a little bit in Croatian and most recently Japanese. And so with all of these languages, I've managed to teach myself them while not being anywhere near a place where they actually are spoken, which is perhaps also somewhat unique. And I'm not a teacher, but I have a method which has worked quite well for me, and I thought I would share it. Alright, so if I was going to learn a language from the ground up, here is how I would do it. The first thing you're going to do is go out and buy a finished language course book. The series that I personally have always used is called Colloquial Languages by Routledge Publishers. I'll put a link in the description to this website. These are essentially a type of condensed language course in book format. There are probably other good series out there apart from Colloquial from Routledge, but this is the series which I've always used and have had great success with. And these books are really, really good. They literally start in chapter 1 by teaching you how to say hello, this is my name. And by the end of the book, they go into the absolute most detailed aspects of the grammar, essentially everything that you need packaged in one very nice book. So going through one of these books, you will essentially gain an introduction to all aspects of the language, everything from a basic solid vocabulary to all of the aspects of the grammar, and simply how you can use the language in everyday life. Another very nice feature of the Colloquial series is that all of the books come with free audio files, which you can download from the website, meaning that you can easily hear all of the dialogue being spoken as well as reading it, which is of course absolutely essential. Now, so the other thing you're going to need is a notebook and a pencil or a pen. And that is because what you're going to do while going through and reading this language book, you are going to write out absolutely everything in that book. Every single line of dialogue, every single word of vocabulary. You're going to go through every single section and actually physically write it out on paper with a pencil or a pen. I think there's actually some science on this, that if you actually write something out, different parts of your brain gets engaged or something like that. But it's very important that you just do not read through the book as if it was a novel, because you're not going to retain nearly anything in the book. It's very important to go very thoroughly, slowly through each chapter and write out absolutely everything that you can physically on paper, similar to this here. And this might look very daunting immediately. It actually is not a lot of work, because one of the biggest advantages of these books is that they're also quite entertaining to go through. They're very nicely structured. It's very easy to sort of, you get everything in bite-sized format as you go through. But you want to write it all out for yourself. The other thing you want to do, in these books, in every single chapter, you're introduced to an aspect of the grammar of the language. And what you want to do is copy out all of these grammar aspects and points as your own personal reference. You want to build up your own personal grammar reference. In all of the books, there is a summarized grammar in the back, but as you go through the book, it's very important that you also build up your own on the side. Not only because you retain a little bit more of it while you actually write it out, but also because you then build up your own personal reference, which can then be used later on in part 2 of this method. For example, anyone who has tried to learn Russian or a Slavic language knows exactly what this is: a verb declension table. And the grammar is by far the most important part of the language to go through at the start. It is the most technical part, but it is ultimately what will really distinguish you as a real speaker of the language later on. Another detail, which I almost forgot to add while editing this, while you are working through this language course and writing everything out, also make sure to speak out loud as much as possible. Repeat back all of the dialogues every single time. Make sure that after you listen to it, you also speak it out yourself. If you do live with people, you will look very weird. You're going to be this person sitting in the corner speaking in a foreign language to himself or herself, but it is of course also a necessary part of that process. So after going through a book in this way, you will not be fluent in the language, but what you will have in your mind is a complete overview of all of the aspects of the language which you will need then to further develop. You will have a full recognition of the grammar, you'll have a very solid basic vocabulary, and you will be ready then to now dive into some media. So here starts a bit of a difficult period, because when you go through one of these language books, it is very nicely structured for you. You get little exercises presented to you, everything which is kind of done for you. And after having now done the course, you now have to go out into the wide world of media and create kind of your own structure. So one of the best things about this part of the method is that things start to become fun. Once you have gained an overview over all of the grammar and technical aspects in part 1, you can now start to a much greater extent to actually make use of the language in your everyday life. One of the advantages, for example, of learning Russian is that just about every book that's ever been written exists on the internet in Russian translation. And especially, for example, I work in architecture. There are some fantastic architecture books written only in the Russian language, which I otherwise would not have access to if I had not taken it upon myself to learn it. So in this stage, you can really be creative and start to actually seek out media, books, other kinds of things in the language which you're learning, which also can then, in the best of cases, help you exceed in other aspects of life which you're otherwise pursuing. Books, of course, written in the language you're trying to learn are probably the best. It's very easy to integrate that into your daily life. Start to read a book written in the language you're trying to learn. To start with, it will be a very tedious process. You'll realize that there is a lot more vocabulary out there which was not introduced in the language course you just finished. But you'll find that as you continue to read and as you continue to go through a book, gradually you'll find that you recognize more and more of the words that you see. A very useful resource that we have now on the internet is video, ideally video with subtitles. One of the absolute best resources you can find is where you are able to watch some kind of video with dialogue in the language you're trying to learn, and then where you also can turn on subtitles, such that you can both listen to the dialogue and at the same time see the words come up on the screen physically, and hear them be pronounced while you read them. And I think now on YouTube, for example, in some cases it's possible to turn on automatically generated subtitles, so it's probably a lot easier to find this than previously. Good place to start any kind of national broadcaster. In a lot of countries it is legally necessary for them to provide subtitles. And it also is useful that in many cases a lot of that kind of media is also available outside of that country if you happen to be living in one place and learning the language of another country. And this is probably one thing which has gotten a lot better since I personally started out. I remember that back in 2009, when I was learning Swedish for the first time, it was pretty slim pickings what you could watch in a foreign country because of licensing rights. So I was watching stuff which I would never otherwise have actually watched. I was watching cooking shows, I was watching children's television, this kind of stuff, simply because it was all that I actually was allowed to watch. Now with YouTube, now with other online movie sites, there's probably a lot more out there where you can find both video, dialogue, and subtitles. And so what you have to do in this stage of the method is really look for ways to use the language in your own life in a variety of ways. As said, you can read books, you can watch movies and videos on the internet. Ideally, also, you should find a way to try to translate stuff into the language which you're trying to learn. What worked brilliantly for me at the time when I was in university, I would translate all of my course notes into the language that I was trying to learn. And by doing that, you get two birds stoned at once. You both are learning a language, you're building active use, and at the same time, you're also memorizing your course notes. So if you have something like that, for example, it is absolutely ideal. A word now on Google Translate. Google Translate is your friend. It is your friend as a dictionary. If you think back to the times before the internet, if you were going to learn a language and if you were reading something and came across a word that you didn't know, you actually had to pick up a book, a dictionary, browse through that dictionary to try to find the word that you were looking for. That whole process for one word would maybe take 50, 60 seconds. Now with Google Translate, you can almost instantly either copy-paste in a word there or just quickly type it out. And to look up a word takes you now 5 or 10 seconds at the absolute most. So what Google Translate does, it really does drastically help you learn faster and expose yourself to new vocabulary faster. It's more of a practical thing. When you will paste in a word, any kind of form, in any kind of inflected form, if you're learning a language that has a lot of inflection, what you also will see in the sidebar is the infinitive verb or the normal form of the adjective. And that is incredibly useful because from the language course that you've just gone through in part 1, you will be able to recognize how all of these words inflect. And by recognizing these different forms, you will be able to just, in a much easier way, put everything together and see the way that the different words in the language inflect. What you do not want to do with Google Translate is paste in big, massive, long sentences and blocks of text. You're not going to retain a lot of it. It tends not to be a very accurate translation, and you really will not get a lot out of that. Google Translate is very useful as a dictionary, but not really as a comprehensive translator for anything. So gradually, as you continue on to use the language in your own life, as you continue on to look at media in the language which you're trying to learn, you will slowly build yourself up to a level of fluency. At the start, it is a very slow process. You're going to always be looking at your grammar reference. You're always going to be looking up words. It's going to feel very, very tedious. But gradually, you'll notice that you start looking up words less and less. Gradually, you notice that just passively you're able to understand the vast majority of what you hear and see. And if you continue on, if you keep on working at it, you will one day wake up and realize that you are actually fluent, for the most part, in the language which you have picked up. So that is my method. That is how I've managed to teach myself several languages to a level of fluency. Now I want to give some general advice on language learning and some tips and tricks, which perhaps might be helpful. So at the very beginning, before you start, it helps to have a very good idea about why you want to speak the language and why you want to learn it, and what you intend to do with it later on, because this is going to drastically impact the motivation you have and how much time you're actually willing to spend on it. For myself, for example, I knew that I was going to try to move to Scandinavia at some point in the near future. I knew that I wanted to study there. And so for me, I knew that basically I was going to use that language at some point in the future. I was very interested in it personally. And so for me, it was very easy to put in all of the effort, spend all of the time, and really try to integrate as much as possible the learning of that language into my everyday life. If you are not very serious about it, if you just kind of want to learn a few phrases here and there, you probably are not going to reach a level of fluency simply because you're not going to be willing to put in the time and you're not going to be willing to spend a lot of time actually engaging with that language. It's important to understand from the beginning that language learning is hours and hours and hours of unpaid time normally spent alone unless you're speaking the language with someone else in the best of cases. But it really is a lot of work, and if you want to speak at a level of fluency, you really have to be willing to put in that work from the beginning. And so it's important that you don't expect to be able to speak fluently if you only want to, for example, go through the language course once and then just kind of let it sit and continue back with your normal life. An important thing to remember is that language learning is also 95% about repetition, especially once you've gone through a language course in part one, especially once you have a good overview over all of the grammar. It's just about repeating as often as possible, as many words as possible, and exposing yourself to as much media as possible. Try, especially when reading books, especially when watching movies, not to be perfect. This is really important because if you, for example, read a book, you come across a word that you do not know yet, look it up once, maybe try in that moment to memorize it, but then move on. You will encounter that word again if it's a word that you need to know, and it's through that long-term continuous repetition and continuous exposure which you ultimately will lead to that memorization. Don't read one word and then focus on it for like 5 minutes and try and memorize it instantly. That will be very, very tedious. The reality is that if it's an important word, you will encounter it again very quickly. It's all about the repetition. It's all about just the continuous exposure. Try also not to get discouraged by internet polyglots. We've all seen these videos of people on YouTube that claim to speak like 35 languages, and they go into a park and they try and speak with as many different people as possible. In practice, the vast majority of these people do not speak the majority of these languages fluently. They might be able to speak a couple of phrases here and there to give the impression of it. The reality is that everyone is limited by time, and especially when it comes to language learning and just kind of the amount of time that you have in a day. Realistically, any given human being is only going to be able to maintain approximately maybe 4 or 5 languages fluently at the most, simply because you just don't have enough time to read in all these different languages, to speak in all these different languages, and maintain them over time. So don't get discouraged by that. Most people at a high level might be able to, if they can devote all of their time to it, maybe speak 3 or 4 languages fluently, certainly not 35 or anything like that. And if you are a first-time language learner, which is to say you speak a native language and now you're learning your second language, have the expectation that it's going to be very, very difficult. The good news is that it gets easier with every new language that you pick up. And this, of course, is going to depend also upon which language you're trying to learn and how different it is structurally from your native language. In my case, for example, Swedish, Norwegian, Icelandic are essentially the same language, meaning that it was very, very easy for me to go from Swedish to Icelandic to Norwegian, given that the grammar is essentially the same, with the exception of Icelandic. That was pretty gnarly. But it's all a variant, essentially, of the same language, the same structure, the same basic foundation. There are people out there, for example, who speak Chinese, English, and Arabic, 3 wildly different languages which have wildly different foundations. For myself, I speak essentially, I guess you'd say, 2 Germanic languages, which have the same basic structure, and I've added a Slavic language, which at the same time is from the Indo-European group, apparently, meaning that a lot of the basic vocabulary is there, a lot of the loan words are there. So don't get discouraged. It will be a difficult process, but it always gets easier as you continue working with it. Personally, I really have not been much in the language learning space because I found my own method here that works, but I do see a lot of people who will just say, go travel to the country where this language is spoken, just kind of immerse yourself in it, and you'll just kind of magically pick stuff up. Personally, I do not think that will work at all. You do need to learn the grammar of a language that you're trying to learn, and there really aren't any shortcuts in terms of how you can do that. You just have to go through the course, learn the difficult tables of inflection and stuff, learn how verbs work, and just kind of go at it that way. I can't see how, if you just kind of wander about and hear various words, that you will magically appear with the grammar of this language in your head. So I will try to make a quick outro. If you are thinking about learning a language, I would highly recommend that you do it, even in today's age where we have all these different translation tools. Personally, I find that what learning languages does for your brain, what it does for your personality, and what it does to just expose you to a foreign place, that is really why you want to do it, first and foremost. It's also very cool. You can impress people at cocktail parties, if people still go to cocktail parties, I'm not sure. But in my personal case, for example, it has really been the basis for the life that I currently live right now. I would not currently be sitting in Norway had I not picked up Swedish at random way back in the day. And I think that especially if you're someone in these days who doesn't really know what you want to study, doesn't really want to know what you want to learn or where you're kind of going, starting to pick up a language is an excellent place to start, because while learning that language, you're going to be exposed to all kinds of different aspects of society, all kinds of different aspects of life, and perhaps you will find, like I did, a lot of inspiration to be exposed to other things while going through the process of learning it. And that then is my method. To summarize, you start by buying a prepackaged language book. You slowly work through that book. You write absolutely everything out by hand. And then, with the grammar reference that you have made in that process, you start to dive into media and you start to look for other ways to start using that language in all kinds of different ways in your everyday life. So I hope that this helps people. I have no idea if it will, but this is in any case how I personally have learned all of the languages that I speak today, with the exception of my native language. Thanks for watching.